I never thought it would feel this easy. The weight of my marriage was finally lifting, and every breath I took felt lighter. Sitting in the sleek black car parked outside the courthouse, I caught my reflection in the window. My skin glowed, my hair was perfectly styled, and my makeup was just right. Today was the start of my new life. Beside me, Nick smirked as he scrolled through his phone, completely at ease. He had every reason to be. After all, we had one. "You ready for this?" he asked, locking his phone and turning toward me. His hazel eyes gleamed with something between amusement and satisfaction. I exhaled sharply, adjusting the gold bracelet on my wrist, his gift to me last week. More than ready. The divorce was a formality at this point. The lawyers had settled almost everything. My soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel, had put up a pathetic fight, but in the end there was little he could do. The house was mine. The alimony was set. And soon, Nick and I would be able to live our lives openly, without sneaking around or pretending. It hadn't always been this way. Once, Daniel and I were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. We had the picture-perfect life, beautiful home, decent cars, fancy vacations. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. I was bored. Daniel was a good man, a stable provider, but he was dull. Predictable. Our marriage had become a series of monotonous routines, with Daniel always prioritizing his work over me. Nick, on the other hand, was different. He was exciting, spontaneous, and made me feel alive. I met him at a real estate seminar last year. He was charming, confident, and had this way of making me feel like the only woman in the world. One harmless coffee turned into lunch, then late-night drinks, then stolen moments in hotel rooms. By the time Daniel started noticing my late nights at the gym, I had already fallen for Nick completely. And now here we were. Nick reached over, brushing his thumb along my wrist. "After this, we celebrate. Champagne and a weekend away, just the two of us. Sound good?" I smiled. "Perfect." We stepped out of the car and walked toward the courthouse together, hand in hand. I didn't care if anyone saw. The divorce was finalized today. Daniel had no claim over me anymore. Inside, the air was sterile and heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. The courtroom was nearly empty aside from the necessary parties. Daniel sat at the other table, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. He looked exhausted. His dark circles had deepened, his suit looked looser than I remembered, and his usual proud stance was gone. For a split second, guilt pricked at me. Then I remembered how miserable I had been. How many nights I spent lying next to a man who barely noticed me anymore. This was for the best. Nick and I took our seats, and as the judge prepared to finalize everything, I couldn't help but smile. I had won. And Daniel knew it. I watched his hands clench into fists, his lawyer barely containing his own frustration. He must have known that fighting me was useless. I had been careful. My lawyer was better. I had played this game with precision, ensuring that I walked away with everything. The judge cleared his throat. "We are here today to finalize the dissolution of marriage between Danielle Carter and Daniel Carter. All terms have been agreed upon, and both parties are prepared to sign the final decree." I nearly let out a breath of relief. It was done. Nick and I exchanged a look, his lips twitched upward, barely containing his satisfaction. He squeezed my thigh under the table, his silent way of saying, "We did it." I felt a bubble of laughter rise in my chest. All of Daniel's fighting, all of his pathetic attempts to hold on to me, and now here we were. He looked like a shell of himself. It was almost funny. And then the judge spoke again. "And before we conclude, I have one final note to address regarding a separate matter brought to my attention." The courtroom fell silent. I blinked. "A separate matter?" I echoed, turning toward my lawyer, who suddenly looked tense. Daniel's eyes finally met mine for the first time all morning. But this time, there was something else in them. Not defeat. Something closer to satisfaction. Nick shifted uncomfortably beside me, sensing the change in the room. And that's when I knew. Daniel had something. And whatever it was about to turn my world upside down. The moment the judge mentioned a separate matter, the smug confidence I'd worn like armor began to crack. It was subtle, like a hairline fracture on glass, barely visible but destined to shatter with the right amount of pressure. Nick shifted beside me, his hand sliding off my thigh. His posture, once relaxed and cocky, straightened with rigid tension. I could feel the heat of his confusion mirroring my own. Daniel's face, though, his face was what unsettled me the most. Gone was the defeated man slumped in his chair just moments ago. He sat up straighter, his eyes dark and steady, lips curled ever so slightly at the corners. Not a smile, not quite. More like satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. What the hell was going on? The judge cleared his throat again, shuffling a stack of papers in front of him. This matter pertains to new evidence submitted to the court late last week. Given its potential implications, I've agreed to review it before finalizing today's proceedings. I leaned toward my lawyer, Jennifer, my voice a harsh whisper. What is he talking about? Jennifer's face was a tight mask of professionalism, but I saw the flicker of concern in her eyes. She shook her head slightly, whispering back, I wasn't notified of any new evidence. This wasn't in the pre-trial disclosures. My heart kicked up its pace. New evidence? What kind of evidence could Daniel possibly have? This divorce had been a clean sweep. I'd covered every angle, every text, every lie. Or so I thought. Daniel's lawyer stood, his smirk a mirror image of Daniel's. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to introduce Exhibit A into the record. The bailiff walked over, collecting a sealed manila envelope. It was thick, its contents bulging slightly. My stomach twisted. I recognized that kind of envelope. Documents. The judge nodded, flipping it open and pulling out a series of papers, skimming the first few pages before glancing over the top of his glasses directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a slight arch of his brow that made my throat go dry. I'll allow the submission, the judge finally said, handing copies to both legal teams. Jennifer's hand was steady as she reached for the packet, but her jaw tightened as she flipped through the pages. I couldn't see the papers from where I sat, but I could feel it, the shift, the sudden weight in the room. Jennifer's face paled. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Something was wrong. What is it? I hissed under my breath, trying to keep my voice low, though every nerve in my body screamed. Jennifer, what is it? She didn't look at me. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice tight. It's financial records. Business documents. She flipped a page, her brows knitting together. Some emails. Danielle, did you have any joint business dealings with Daniel during the marriage? My blood ran cold. I shook my head automatically. No. Of course not. I wasn't involved in any of his business stuff. That was always his thing. But Jennifer's face remained tense. Then why are there emails here with your name on them? Transfers. Offshore accounts. Danielle, is there something you didn't tell me? I could feel Nick stiffen beside me. Wait, he muttered. What emails? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. I had been careful. Meticulous. I'd deleted everything, every message between me and Nick that could have been used against us. I was certain of it. But Daniel had something. The judge cleared his throat again, snapping my attention back to the front. These documents suggest a significant financial discrepancy, he said, his voice calm but firm. It appears that during the course of the marriage, Mrs. Carter engaged in unauthorized transactions using marital funds to support, he paused, flipping another page, an extramarital relationship. The words hit me like a slap. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the faint rustle of papers. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Nick's jaw clenched, his face darkening with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath, though his voice was louder than he intended. Daniel didn't flinch. He just sat there, arms crossed, watching me unravel. Jennifer leaned in again, her voice a harsh whisper. "Danielle, if you transferred any money from joint accounts to support Nick, or any other personal expenses tied to the affair, you should have told me. This changes everything." I shook my head frantically. I didn't. But the words felt hollow, even to me. Because suddenly, my mind flashed to all the little things I'd done without thinking they'd ever matter. The weekend trips, the hotel stays, the credit card Daniel never really monitored because he trusted me. The gifts I'd bought for Nick. The wire transfer I'd sent that one time when Nick needed help covering a business deal. It had seemed like nothing. Just small things. But Daniel had found everything. The judge continued, "In light of this evidence, the court will need to reassess the financial terms of the divorce, including alimony and property distribution." "Reassess?" "No," I blurted out, my voice louder than I intended. "This wasn't part of the agreement. We already settled." Daniel's lawyer cut in smoothly, "With all due respect, Your Honor, the settlement was based on the assumption of full financial transparency. This evidence proves that my client was misled." Nick leaned closer to me, his voice low and furious. "Did you seriously use his money? Our money? Are you insane?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, trying to find an explanation, an excuse, anything. But Daniel had already won. And for the first time since this all began, it wasn't me holding the cards. The courtroom felt colder than it had moments ago. The fluorescent lights, harsh and unflattering, seemed to spotlight every crack in my carefully constructed facade. My palms were slick with sweat, heart pounding in my chest like a drum signaling defeat. Daniel didn't even have to say a word. He just watched me, his piercing stare a silent reminder of everything I'd underestimated. Nick shifted beside me, his thigh tense against mine, though he'd stopped making any effort to touch me. His face was stone, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. The judge's voice broke through the tension, each word a nail in the coffin I hadn't realized I'd built for myself. "Given the nature of the financial discrepancies presented, this court will delay finalizing the divorce settlement until a full forensic audit is conducted. The court also reserves the right to revisit the agreed-upon alimony and property divisions based on the findings." Delay? I felt like the air had been sucked from the room. This wasn't supposed to happen. Today was supposed to be the end. Clean. Simple. I was supposed to walk out of here with the house, the money, and the life I'd been planning with Nick. Instead, I was watching it slip through my fingers like sand. Jennifer, ever the professional, leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. "You need to stay calm. The worst thing you can do right now is react emotionally in front of the judge." Easy for her to say. It wasn't her life unraveling. I could feel Nick's anger simmering beside me. He didn't look at me, didn't offer the reassuring squeeze of my hand like he had earlier. No, his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the judge like he could will this nightmare away with sheer force. But it wasn't going away. Daniel's lawyer stood again, his voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor, we'd also like to motion for an immediate freeze on all joint accounts and assets until the audit is complete, to prevent further unauthorized transactions." I snapped my head toward Jennifer, panic rising. She hesitated for the briefest moment before standing. "Your Honor," she began, her tone calm but firm, "this is an extreme measure. My client has cooperated fully throughout these proceedings, and there's no indication of current misconduct. The judge didn't even flinch. The motion is granted. Granted. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Nick finally turned to me, his voice low but venomous. Are you serious right now? A freeze? What the hell did you do, Danielle? I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? Sorry, I used Daniel's money to fund our affair. Sorry, I thought I was smarter than him. Daniel remained silent, watching with that infuriating calm, his lawyer doing all the talking while he sat there, victorious without lifting a finger. I hated him for it. The judge continued, addressing both legal teams. I expect full cooperation from both parties during the audit. We'll reconvene in 30 days to review the findings. 30 days. I was supposed to be free today. I was supposed to be celebrating with Nick, sipping champagne, maybe even planning our next vacation. Instead, I was trapped, financially and emotionally, by the very man I thought I'd outsmarted. The gavel hit the sound block with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the session. But it wasn't the end. Not even close. As people began to gather their papers, I stayed seated, frozen in place. Nick stood abruptly, shoving his chair back with a screech that echoed through the room. Let's go, he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. I scrambled to gather my things, my hands trembling. As we made our way toward the door, I couldn't help but glance back. Daniel was still there, calm as ever, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, he smiled. Not a big, gloating grin. Just a small, satisfied curve of his lips, like this was exactly how he planned it. Nick didn't say a word as we left the courthouse, his strides long and quick, forcing me to jog slightly to keep up. The second we stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to cool the heat of humiliation burning under my skin. He rounded on me the moment we reached the car. What the hell was that, Danielle? His voice was low but sharp, like a blade sliding between my ribs. I glanced around nervously. Can we not do this here? Oh, now you care about appearances, he shot back, unlocking the car with a violent click. Get in. The drive was silent for exactly 2 blocks before he exploded. You told me this was handled. You said there was nothing he could use against you. I didn't think. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't think. His words stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd always known Nick had a temper, but this was different. This wasn't just anger. This was rage. You think I planned for this? I shot back, my own temper flaring. I didn't know he had anything. I was careful. Careful, he barked out a humorless laugh. You used his money, Danielle. For us. Do you have any idea how that looks? I stared out the window, my jaw clenched. I didn't need him to spell it out. I already knew how it looked. Like I'd been reckless. Like I'd dragged him into a mess he never signed up for. But he wasn't exactly innocent here. You weren't complaining when I was paying for your business trip to Miami, I snapped, the words out before I could stop them. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. Don't you dare put this on me. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. When we finally pulled up to his apartment, he didn't even wait for the car to stop completely before opening the door. Where are you going? I demanded. He didn't answer. Just slammed the door behind him, leaving me alone in the car with nothing but the echo of my own mistakes. I sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard, the weight of everything pressing down on me. For the first time since this all began, I realized something terrifying. I might not win this. I sat alone in Nick's car for what felt like an eternity, staring at the dashboard as if it held the answers I desperately needed. My reflection in the dark screen was unfamiliar, eyes hollow, lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. The confident, radiant woman who'd strutted into that courtroom just hours earlier was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize. The realization hit me harder than I expected. I might actually lose everything. I finally forced myself out of the car, my legs shaky beneath me. Nick hadn't come back, and part of me knew he wasn't going to, not tonight, maybe not ever. His apartment door remained closed, the lights off behind the thin curtains. Coward. But could I really blame him? I drove home in silence, the roads blurring past as my thoughts raced faster than the car. The house felt emptier than usual when I walked in. The faint echo of my heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound. I kicked them off, collapsing onto the couch without even turning on the lights. This was supposed to be our house, mine and Nick's. A fresh start, free from the suffocating history of Daniel. Now it felt like a prison. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling slightly as I typed out a message to Nick. Call me. Simple. Direct. No point in pleading. He didn't respond. Hours passed. The sky outside darkened, and the room grew colder. I wrapped a blanket around myself, not because I was cold, but because I felt exposed, like the walls could see through me, judging me the same way Daniel had in that courtroom. Daniel. God, I hated him. Not just for what he'd done today, but for how calm he'd been while doing it. That smug little smile, like he'd been waiting for this moment, savoring it. He knew exactly where to hit me, and he'd aimed with precision. I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every detail of the court proceedings, every word the judge had said. Forensic audit. Asset freeze. Reassess alimony. Each phrase echoed like a hammer striking metal, loud and jarring. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, casting a dull gray light into the living room, I realized I couldn't sit here and wait. I needed answers. I needed to know how Daniel had managed this. I grabbed my phone again, this time dialing Jennifer. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but sharp. Danielle? I need to see you, I blurted out. Now. She sighed heavily. It's 7 a.m. I don't care. Please. I need to know what's going on. A pause. Then, fine. Meet me at my office in an hour. I was already pulling on clothes before she hung up. Jennifer's office was sterile and cold, much like the courtroom had been. She sat behind her sleek glass desk, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. A folder sat in front of her, the same one from court. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I've gone through the documents again, she said, flipping the folder open. It's bad, Danielle. I swallowed hard, sliding into the chair opposite her. How bad? She looked me dead in the eye. If Daniel's claims hold up, and based on this evidence, they might, you could not only lose the house and alimony, but you could also be facing legal consequences. I stared at her, stunned. Legal consequences? For what? It's not like I stole from him. Misappropriation of marital assets, she replied flatly. If he can prove you deliberately used joint funds to support an extramarital affair, it could be classified as financial misconduct. In some cases, even fraud. I felt the blood drain from my face. But it wasn't like that. I didn't steal anything. We were married. It was our money. Jennifer arched an eyebrow. Exactly. Marital money. Which means he had a legal claim to it. Using it to fund an affair? Judges don't look kindly on that, Danielle. Especially when it involves substantial sums. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be a divorce, not a damn criminal trial. What do we do? I croaked, my throat dry. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. Damage control. First, we need to prepare for the audit. We'll have to disclose everything: bank statements, credit card records, transfers. All of it. My stomach twisted. There were things I really didn't want anyone to see. And, she continued, her tone growing even more serious, you need to be honest with me. All of it, Danielle. If there's anything else, anything you haven't told me, I need to know now. I hesitated. There were details I'd glossed over before. Small things. A wire transfer here, a business loan to Nick there. Nothing major, at least, that's what I told myself. Jennifer's eyes narrowed. Danielle. I exhaled shakily. There was some money. I gave Nick a little when he needed help with his business. But it wasn't a lot, just a few thousand here and there. Jennifer closed her eyes briefly, pinching the bridge of her nose. That's exactly the kind of thing Daniel's going to use against you. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I didn't think it mattered. I snapped, my frustration spilling over. I didn't think any of this would matter. It's just money. She shook her head. Not in divorce court. Not when it's tied to an affair. I slumped in the chair, my hands trembling slightly. Do you think Daniel planned this? I whispered. Like, the whole time? Jennifer was quiet for a moment before answering. I think he suspected more than he let on. And I think he's been waiting for the right moment to use it against you. Waiting. The word echoed in my mind. Daniel had been waiting, watching, biding his time, letting me think I'd won. I left Jennifer's office feeling more lost than when I arrived. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Nick's car parked a few houses down. My heart leapt for a brief second, maybe he'd come to talk, maybe he was here to apologize. But as I got closer, I saw him. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, laughing softly at something he said. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the same way he used to do with me. I froze. The betrayal hit harder than I expected. Not because I was heartbroken, God knows I'd done my fair share of betraying, but because of the timing. He was already moving on, already replacing me, while I was left to drown in the mess we'd created together. My phone buzzed in my hand, pulling me from my thoughts. A text from an unknown number. Thought you should know, Daniel isn't done with you yet. My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, my heart racing. What the hell did that mean? I stared at the message on my phone, the words etched into the screen like a threat. Thought you should know, Daniel isn't done with you yet. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. I checked the number, no name, just a string of digits I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to call back, demand answers, but something stopped me. Instead, I sat there, gripping the phone as if it held my entire life in its fragile glass shell. Daniel isn't done with you yet. Of course he wasn't. The man I thought I knew, the man I'd married, shared a life with, betrayed, was gone. The Daniel I faced now wasn't interested in closure. He wanted destruction. I looked up from my phone, my gaze drawn back to Nick and the woman beside him. She was pretty, in that effortlessly casual way. No heavy makeup, just a natural glow, her smile soft and easy as she laughed at something Nick said. He reached out, brushing his hand along her arm, and I felt a sharp sting in my chest. Was that how I looked when I first met him? Carefree? Alive? Stupid. I didn't even realize I'd gotten out of the car until I was halfway across the street, my heels clicking against the pavement, my anger drowning out any rational thought. Nick. I snapped, my voice sharp and brittle. He turned, surprised, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation in the span of a heartbeat. Oh, he muttered, his tone flat. Danielle. The woman beside him gave me a polite smile, clearly unaware she was about to be caught in the crossfire. We need to talk, I said, ignoring her completely. Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm kind of busy right now. Busy? I nearly laughed. Busy replacing me, apparently. This isn't optional, I snapped. It's about Daniel. His jaw tightened at the mention of Daniel's name. That got his attention. He muttered something to the woman, Maya, I think he said, then followed me back toward the car, his steps heavy with frustration. What now? He hissed as soon as we were out of earshot. I shoved the phone toward him. This. He read the message, his brow furrowing slightly. Then he shrugged. Could be anyone. Or it could be Daniel, I shot back. You saw him in court. He's not finished. He's planning something. Nick let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, because you're the victim here. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to scream. This isn't about playing the victim, Nick. This is about both of us being screwed if he pulls something bigger. His face softened just a fraction, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. Fine, he muttered. What do you want to do? I didn't have an answer. For the first time in this entire mess, I realized I had no plan. We ended up at Nick's apartment. Not because I wanted to be there, but because I didn't know where else to go. The place was exactly as I remembered, messy, cluttered with things he never bothered to put away. It used to feel exciting, like a secret life carved out just for us. Now it just felt small. Nick grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, tossing one toward me without asking if I wanted it. I caught it, more out of reflex than gratitude. So, he said, flopping onto the couch. What's the plan, genius? I glared at him, dropping into the chair opposite him. I don't know. That's why I'm here. He scoffed. Of course you don't. I ignored the jab, focusing instead on the message still burning in my mind. Daniel isn't done with you yet. What if he has more? I whispered, mostly to myself. What if the emails and bank statements were just the start? Nick didn't respond right away. He took a long sip of his beer, staring at the wall like it held answers. Then he said, maybe we should get ahead of it. I frowned. What do you mean? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I mean we stop waiting for him to make the next move. We find out what he's planning. Get ahead of it. How? A slow smile crept across his face, one I recognized all too well. It was the same smile he'd had when he first convinced me to sneak away with him, back when all of this was just a thrill, not a disaster. I know someone, he said. A guy who can get information. Quietly. I hesitated. This was dangerous territory. But what choice did I have? Fine, I said. Do it. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and restless waiting. Nick's guy, some shady friend of a friend, promised to dig into Daniel's financials, emails, whatever he could find. Meanwhile, I was left to stew in my own paranoia. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face in that courtroom, calm, collected, victorious. I replayed every conversation we'd ever had, every argument, trying to pinpoint when he'd started plotting against me. Had he known the whole time? Was every I love you just a lie wrapped in patience? On the 3rd day, Nick called. I've got something, he said, his voice low. I was at the house as Daniel's house, technically, though it felt less like mine with every passing day. I grabbed my keys and was out the door in seconds. When I arrived at Nick's apartment, he was pacing, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. What is it? I demanded. He didn't answer right away. Just handed me the phone. It was an email. From Daniel. To someone named Caroline Weston. My heart pounded as I read the subject line. Final phase of the plan. I swallowed hard, scrolling through the message. It was short, but every word hit like a punch to the gut. She suspects nothing. The audit is just the beginning. Once that's done, we move to the next phase. I want everything documented, every lie, every transaction, every betrayal. She won't see it coming. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. What the hell does that mean? I whispered. Nick didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew exactly what it meant. Daniel wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to destroy me. I couldn't breathe. The words from Daniel's email burned in my mind, each one a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. She suspects nothing. The audit is just the beginning. Once that's done, we move to the next phase. I want everything documented, every lie, every transaction, every betrayal. She won't see it coming. I sat on Nick's battered couch, my hands trembling as I stared at the phone lying between us. It felt like holding a grenade with the pin pulled, seconds away from detonation. Nick paced the room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair, muttering under his breath. He wasn't used to losing control, and Daniel had just flipped the game on both of us. This can't be real, I whispered, more to myself than to Nick. He couldn't have planned all this. Nick stopped pacing, his jaw clenched. Oh, it's real. And he's been 10 steps ahead of us the whole time. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I thought back to every argument, every conversation, every moment I'd dismissed Daniel's quiet demeanor as weakness. But it wasn't weakness. It was strategy. He'd been watching me. Studying me. Waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I forced myself to focus. Who's Caroline Weston? Nick picked up the phone again, scrolling through the email. No idea. But if she's part of this, she knows what Daniel's planning. We need to find her. Nick nodded, already pulling out his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his expression dark and focused. I watched in silence, my mind replaying the last year of my life like a movie on fast forward. Every lie, every betrayal, every secret I thought I'd buried deep enough to stay hidden. But Daniel had found them. And he wasn't just exposing them. He was weaponizing them. After a few tense minutes, Nick's face lit up with recognition. Got her. He turned the screen toward me. A professional-looking headshot stared back, Caroline Weston, corporate investigator. She worked for a private firm specializing in financial forensics and... I felt the blood drain from my face. Divorce litigation support, I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. Nick slammed his fist against the table. That's how he's doing it. He hired her to dig into your life, your finances, everything. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just about the money anymore. Daniel was out for blood. I stood abruptly, the room spinning slightly. We need to talk to her. Nick looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Are you insane? She works for him. She's not going to tell us anything. I met his gaze, my jaw set. Then we'll make her. 2 days later, we found Caroline. She was leaving an office building downtown, her sharp suit and confident stride making her easy to spot. She looked like the type of woman who thrived on control, the kind who didn't flinch under pressure. But everyone had a weak spot. Nick and I followed her to a nearby cafe, watching from across the street. I could feel the tension radiating off him, but I didn't care. I was done playing defense. This is a bad idea, he muttered, glancing around nervously. I ignored him, standing and crossing the street before he could stop me. Caroline was seated alone, scrolling through her phone. I slid into the seat across from her without an invitation, my heart pounding but my face composed. She looked up, surprised but not startled. Can I help you? I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. You're Caroline Weston. You're working for my ex-husband. I want to know what he's planning. Her expression didn't change. She set her phone down slowly, folding her hands neatly on the table. I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else. I smiled tightly. Drop the act. I know who you are. I've seen the emails. That got her attention. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition breaking through her professional mask. But she recovered quickly. If you're referring to private communications, you're already treading on legal territory. I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Legal territory? You mean like digging into my finances without my knowledge? Spying on me? Her lips curved into a small, condescending smile. It's called due diligence. Your husband is within his rights to protect his interests during a divorce. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice to a sharp whisper. This isn't about the divorce. This is about destroying me. So whatever he's paying you, I hope it's worth it. Caroline didn't flinch. It's not personal, Mrs. Carter. It's business. But her eyes told a different story. There was something there, hesitation, maybe even guilt buried under layers of professionalism. I decided to push. You think he's going to stop with me? You think he's not going to turn on you when you're no longer useful? I watched her carefully, saw the faintest twitch in her jaw. Daniel doesn't leave loose ends. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I'm not the enemy, I added, my voice softening just enough. But if he's planning something bigger, I need to know. You don't want to get caught in the crossfire. For the first time, her composure cracked. It was subtle, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She glanced around, then leaned in slightly. Whatever you think you know, it's worse. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I whispered. Caroline's gaze darted around the cafe again, her voice barely audible. Daniel isn't just trying to win in court. He's building a case. Not for divorce. For fraud. For criminal charges. I felt the blood drain from my face. He wants to ruin you, she continued quietly. Financially. Legally. Personally. He doesn't want you to walk away with nothing. He wants you to walk away with less than nothing. My chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. How do I stop him? I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. Caroline hesitated, then finally said, you can't. But maybe you can beat him to it. Back at Nick's apartment, I told him everything. He's trying to have me arrested, I whispered, still reeling from Caroline's words. Nick ran his hands through his hair, pacing the small living room. For what? The money? He can't. Yes, he can, I snapped. If he proves I used marital funds illegally, he can frame it as fraud. He's not just coming after the money, Nick. He's coming after me. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of it all pressing down like a boulder. Finally, Nick broke the silence. Maybe we need to flip the script. I frowned. What do you mean? He turned to face me, his eyes dark and calculating. If Daniel's building a case against you, maybe it's time we build one against him. I stared at him, the idea sinking in slowly. If Daniel wanted a war, maybe it was time I fought back. I stared at the email, my heart pounding so hard it felt like the walls were closing in. She thinks she's winning. Good. Let her. Daniel's words were like a poison seeping into my veins, unraveling any illusion of control I thought I had. This wasn't a victory. It was bait. A carefully crafted trail designed to lead me exactly where he wanted me to go. And I had followed it, blind, desperate, foolish. I could hear Nick's footsteps approaching from the kitchen, his voice casual, oblivious. I found more in that folder, some bank transfers we can. Stop. My voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. He froze, a beer bottle in his hand, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to concern. What's wrong? I turned the laptop toward him, pointing at the screen with a trembling finger. This is what's wrong. He leaned over, reading the line silently. I watched his face, waiting for the realization to hit. When it did, his jaw clenched, and he slammed the laptop shut with a curse. Son of a... I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. This was never about the divorce. The financial records, the offshore accounts, even Marcy, all of it. He wanted us to find it. He wanted us to think we had leverage. Nick rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration boiling over. But why? What's the end game? I stopped pacing, the answer hitting me like a punch to the gut. Because he's setting us up, I whispered. For something bigger. Nick's eyes narrowed. Bigger than fraud? I nodded slowly, my heart sinking with the weight of the realization. Criminal charges. Maybe worse. We sat in silence, the gravity of the situation settling over us like a thick fog. He knew we'd get desperate, I muttered. Knew we'd dig. And now we're holding the evidence he wants us to have. Nick stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. We need to talk to Marcy again. Marcy didn't answer her phone. Or her texts. By the time we drove back to the bar where we'd met her, the place was closed, dark windows reflecting our anxious faces. Maybe she's just, Nick started, but the words died in his throat when we saw it. Police cars. 2 of them, parked haphazardly outside an apartment building down the street. I don't know what made me follow them. Instinct, maybe. Or pure, gut-wrenching fear. We slipped through the small crowd gathering near the entrance, our hearts racing in sync. And that's when we saw the stretcher. Covered. A paramedic pushed it past us, the sheet pulled tight over a body I didn't need to see to recognize. Marcy. My knees nearly buckled. Nick grabbed my arm, pulling me away before anyone could notice. We didn't speak as we hurried back to the car, slamming the doors shut behind us, the silence deafening. She's dead, I whispered, my voice trembling. Nick stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. This isn't a coincidence. No. It wasn't. Marcy had known too much. And now she was gone. Back at Nick's apartment, the walls felt like they were closing in. I couldn't sit still. My mind was racing, replaying every conversation, every detail. Daniel's calm smile in court. The cryptic text from the unknown number. Caroline Weston's warning. This isn't just about the divorce. It's worse. Nick finally broke the silence. We need to go to the police. I shook my head violently. And tell them what? That my ex-husband is some criminal mastermind? That we've been illegally digging through his financial records? That the woman we met 2 days ago is suddenly dead after we poked around? He didn't argue. He knew I was right. Going to the police would only make things worse. Daniel had outplayed us at every turn. He'd set the trap, baited it, and we'd walked right in, holding the smoking gun. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. What do we do now? I whispered. Nick sat beside me, his voice low and grim. We find out what he's planning. Before it's too late. The next morning, we got our first clue. Another email. But this time, it wasn't from Daniel. It was from the same unknown number that had messaged me before. You're running out of time. Check the news. My heart raced as I grabbed Nick's laptop, pulling up the local news website. And there it was. Local businesswoman found dead in apparent suicide. Marcy's photo stared back at me, her face frozen in time, the headline framing her death as nothing more than a tragic, isolated event. But I knew better. So did Nick. Beneath the article, a line of small text caught my eye. Authorities have no suspects at this time. No suspects. Of course they didn't. Because Daniel had covered his tracks. Again. Later that day, I received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. A printed photo. It was me. Taken from a distance, blurry but unmistakable. I was standing outside Marcy's apartment the night she died. On the back of the photo, one sentence was scrawled in black ink. "You're next." I stared at the photo, my fingers trembling around its edges. The blurry image of me standing outside Marcy's apartment felt like a ghost, a snapshot of a moment that had been insignificant just days ago, now twisted into something sinister. "You're next." The words on the back weren't just a threat. They were a promise. Nick was pacing again, his steps sharp against the apartment's creaky floorboards. He'd been doing that a lot lately, like movement could somehow keep the fear from settling too deeply. But the fear had already sunk into my bones, cold and unrelenting. "This is bad," he muttered, running his hands through his hair. "Really bad." "No kidding," I snapped, my voice brittle. Nick stopped pacing, his eyes dark as he stared at the photo in my hand. "He's not just trying to ruin you in court anymore. This is beyond that." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, thoughts spiraling like a whirlpool. Marcy's dead. Daniel's watching me. And somehow, he's always 10 steps ahead. I sank onto the couch, pressing my fingers to my temples. My head throbbed with the weight of it all, the pressure building like an invisible vice. "Maybe we should go to the police," Nick suggested again, his voice low. I looked up at him, my eyes hollow. "And tell them what? That my ex-husband is a criminal mastermind who's trying to kill me? They'll laugh us out of the station." Nick didn't argue. He knew I was right. Daniel had crafted this so perfectly, layer upon layer of deception, manipulation, and control. Even if we did go to the police, who would they believe? The successful businessman with a spotless record? Or the bitter ex-wife with a string of poor decisions trailing behind her like breadcrumbs? I'm trapped. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floor, every shadow outside the window felt like Daniel's presence closing in. I kept the curtains drawn, double-locked the doors, and jumped at every unexpected sound. Nick tried to keep it together, but I could see the cracks forming. His temper flared more easily, his patience thin. We were unraveling, both of us caught in a web we'd helped spin. One night, as I sat staring at the same photo for what felt like the 100th time, Nick dropped onto the couch beside me with a heavy sigh. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered. I didn't respond. He rubbed his face with both hands, then looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and tired. "We need to flip the script. Trap him for a change." I frowned. "How?" Nick hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like someone might be listening, even though we were alone. "We make him think he's already won." The plan was reckless. Desperate. But it was all we had. If Daniel thrived on control, we'd give him the illusion that he still had it. We'd make him believe I was broken, beaten. That I was ready to surrender. The bait? Me. We staged everything carefully. I sent Daniel an email from a new account, one I knew he'd trace back to me without hesitation. "You win. I'm done fighting." Short. Defeated. Exactly what he'd expect from someone crumbling under pressure. Then, we waited. The response came quicker than I anticipated. A reply from Daniel. "Meet me tomorrow. Alone. 8 p.m. The old pier. No threats. No demands. Just an address and a time." Nick wanted to come with me, but we both knew that wouldn't work. Daniel would expect me to be alone. Vulnerable. That's the point, I reminded myself as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized anymore. I looked tired. Older. My eyes hollow, skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You're not the victim," I told myself. Not anymore. I tucked the small recording device Nick had given me into my jacket pocket. Our only hope was to catch Daniel saying something, anything, that could be used against him. Proof. Real proof. I didn't know if it would work. But I had to try. The old pier was exactly as I remembered it, empty, quiet, the faint sound of waves lapping against the wooden beams below. The air was cold, the wind biting against my skin as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I arrived early, my heart pounding with every passing second. Then, I saw him. Daniel. He walked toward me with that same calm, collected demeanor, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. I forced myself to stand still, to look the party defeated, fragile, like someone who had finally accepted the inevitable. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Well," he said softly. "Look at you." I didn't respond. He took a step closer. "I have to admit, Danielle, I expected more from you. But I guess in the end, you're exactly who I thought you were." I clenched my fists in my pockets, my fingers brushing against the recorder. "Why?" I whispered, my voice trembling just enough to sell the act. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him. "Because I can," he replied simply. I swallowed hard, glancing down to hide the fury boiling beneath the surface. "I loved you," I whispered, my voice cracking. He laughed softly, a low, cruel sound. "And look where that got you." I felt the tears sting my eyes, but this time, they weren't an act. "You ruined me," I whispered. Daniel's smile faded slightly. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine now. "No, Danielle," he murmured. "You ruined yourself. I just helped." I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling around the recorder, pressing the small button without him noticing. "You never stood a chance," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "This was over the moment you thought you were smarter than me." My heart raced. "Keep talking. Just keep talking." But then, his hand shot out, gripping my arm tightly. My breath hitched. "I know what you're doing," he whispered in my ear, his grip tightening. "You think this is some kind of game? That you can trap me. But you're already trapped, Danielle. And there's no way out." My blood turned to ice. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Then, out of nowhere, Nick. He tackled Daniel from behind, sending both of them crashing to the ground. I stumbled back, gasping for air as they fought, fists flying, grunts of pain echoing in the cold night air. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. "Help!" I screamed. "There's an attack at the old pier. Hurry!" Daniel managed to land a punch, sending Nick sprawling to the ground. He turned toward me, his face twisted with rage. "You think this ends here," he snarled, stepping closer. But then, sirens. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement. Daniel froze. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He tried to run, but it was too late. The police tackled him to the ground, cuffing his wrists behind his back. I collapsed to my knees, the adrenaline finally crashing over me like a wave. It was over. Or so I thought. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in harsh strokes, casting long shadows across the old pier. I sat on the cold, splintered wood, my knees pulled to my chest, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, but the adrenaline that had kept me upright was fading fast, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and fear. Daniel was face down on the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back, the police pinning him as he struggled. But there was no fight left in his eyes now. No smug grin. Just rage. And for the first time, I was the one watching him fall apart. Nick sat beside me, his lip bleeding, one eye already swelling from the fight. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, wincing every time he inhaled too deeply. "You okay?" he rasped. I nodded numbly, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Was I okay? I didn't feel okay. I felt broken. The hours that followed were a blur of questions, flashing cameras, and sterile police stations. The recording device in my pocket had done its job. Daniel's arrogance had been his undoing. His words, "You never stood a chance. This was over the moment you thought you were smarter than me," were enough to keep him in custody. Enough to start unraveling the carefully crafted facade he'd built over the years. But the damage was already done. I was still facing charges related to the financial mess, the fraud, the embezzlement, the lies. Daniel's downfall didn't erase my mistakes. And as much as I hated him, I couldn't ignore one simple, brutal truth. I'd played the game, too. And I'd lost more than I ever thought possible. Weeks passed. The courtroom felt different this time. Colder. The same sterile walls, the same uncomfortable seats, but the roles had shifted. Daniel sat where I once did, at the defendant's table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed with the arrogance he still tried to wear like armor. His eyes found mine as I walked in, but the smug confidence was gone. Now he just looked empty. The trial was quick. The evidence was overwhelming, thanks to Marcy, to the recordings, to every mistake Daniel had made while trying to destroy me. But I wasn't celebrating. Because despite everything, I was still there, sitting on the opposite side, my own fate hanging in the balance. When the judge called my name, my heart nearly stopped. I stood slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. The charges were read out: fraud, misuse of marital assets, obstruction. My lawyer had done her best, painting me as the victim, as someone manipulated by a controlling, abusive husband. There was some truth to that. But it wasn't the whole story. Because I wasn't innocent. I'd lied. I'd cheated. I'd stolen. I'd destroyed lives. The judge's gavel came down like a final heartbeat. My sentence wasn't as harsh as Daniel's, but it was enough. Community service. Fines. A record that would follow me for the rest of my life. And the crushing weight of knowing I'd done this to myself. Months later, I found myself standing in front of a small apartment in the city, a far cry from the house I used to own, the life I used to have. Nick was gone. We'd drifted apart after everything settled. Maybe because we were both reminders of mistakes we couldn't forget. I'd thought about reaching out to him, but what was the point? There was nothing left to salvage. I stared at my reflection in the dirty glass of the apartment window. No makeup. No designer clothes. Just me, stripped down to nothing but the woman I'd become. And I didn't recognize her. The only thing left was the memory of it all. The love. The lies. The betrayal. The woman who thought she could outsmart everyone, including herself. And in the end, Daniel had been right about one thing. I never stood a chance.